Absence makes the heart grow fonder. Many of us are quite likely to believe that sentiment, and on occasions have probably experienced it. But unfortunately, that old adage isn't always true. Charles Schulz, who was the creator of the Peanuts cartoon, expressed a sad but realistic truth when he said, "Absence makes the heart grow fonder, but it sure makes the rest of you lonely." Absence makes the heart grow fonder. Well, not always. And that's certainly the case in today's Old Testament reading. In Exodus 32, as Angus read to us, we find the people of Israel at the base of Mount Sinai, and they've been there for some time. Moses has climbed the mountain to commune with God. And while Exodus portrays that everything is going well up the mountain, down the mountain, things are sort of getting a little edgy. And the Israelites, they don't have the modern sort of luxury, or we may say curse, of a 24/7 news service. All they are thinking is that Moses has been up there a long time, and who knows what's happened to him. And as each hour and day passes, their attitude towards Moses hardens. And they call him that man. It's a sort of demeaning, damning, belittling statement. That man. Yet they've forgotten that man was God's instrument of freedom. That man was the one who would lead them into a land flowing with milk and honey, rather than remaining in a land of strawless bricks, whips, and no future. And all they know is that man isn't where he should be. And if he's not here, it doesn't look like God is here either. And so, a bit disappointed by the absence of Moses and of God, they move their attention to Moses' second in command, who is Aaron, his brother. And they gather around Aaron, not like around a campfire for s'mores and some late night stories, but around like a lynch mob, intent on making their requests very clear, or else. Make us some gods, tangible, easily accessible, gods who won't disappear when Moses goes walkabout, gods who we can see. And Aaron, who doesn't seem to have Moses' conviction or strength, succumbs. He succumbs to peer pressure, which, as we know, is far stronger than we often would care to admit. And so under Aaron's guidance, they deposit their jewelry into the cauldron, and gold rings become a golden calf. And beholding Aaron's new creation, they cry out, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt." Really? This cod-chewing recent addition to the Mount Sinai art gallery is the living God? The God of their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or Israel, after whom they're named? The one who brought them out of Egyptian slavery? Who performed miracles before them in Egypt and fed them in the desert, gave water when thirst threatened? Who guided them by cloud and fire? Who gave them Moses as a guide and the 10 Commandments as a guide for righteous living? All we can really say is that Moses' absence hasn't made their hearts grow fonder for God. Moses' absence hasn't made their hearts grow fonder for God. The first commandment emphatically states, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods besides me." But the people want gods they can see and handle and carry with them. They want gods that most of all they control. Isn't that the greatest idolatry? to be like God, knowing good and evil, to be in control of our own lives. And before we shake our heads in disbelief at those ancient ancestors of ours, I mean really a gold calf, as if we would sort of stoop to that. But we might well begin to ask ourselves, what does the absence of God unveil in us? Is it always faithfulness and a deepening love? And what place does control have in our relationship with God? And how often do we listen to what we seem to think is right rather than the voice of God Himself? And Aaron, realizing that he might have gone too far, he tries to appease God, to put things right. But unfortunately, he makes things worse. He builds an altar in front of the calf and declares a festival to the Lord, only to find that what transpires is a sort of a mishmash of God worship and bacchanalian excess. But before we judge Aaron too harshly, how many of us have thought that we can have it both ways? How many of us have thought we can have God and we can have this as well? You see, in the people of Israel and Aaron, we're confronted with not only the absence of Moses, we're actually confronted with the absence of God. Which, as we have seen, doesn't always lead us to faithfulness, to life, a deeper fondness and love. But nor does that mean that the absence of God is a failing on our part. Many of us have spent considerable portions of our lives wrestling with the absence of God. It's a very real experience. Even those we would call saints have been through this experience, where they have had to face an encounter and live with the seeming absence of God from them and their lives. I am mindful that there may be people, or us here today, who are in those circumstances. And if this is where we're at, may I offer two things to ponder and pray about. The first is, learn from the people of Israel and Aaron. It is possible, when confronted with the absence of God, to take a way that leads only to ultimate futility, despair, and death. It is possible. It is very real. But also, if we find ourselves in this space, take encouragement from Henry Nouwen's observation of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, when the absence of God was most acute, even for he who was the Son of God. Nouwen says that where God's absence was most loudly expressed, God's presence was most profoundly revealed. When God, through the humanity of Jesus, freely chose to share our own most painful experience of divine absence, God became most present to us. Experiencing the absence of God is not easy. Being in that space can be difficult and dispiriting. But be encouraged in that sense, that even in absence, there is great hope. That Jesus, whom we look to, who we say that we follow and serve, in Him we find our hope. That as Nouwen says, that even in our deepest despair, even in that greatest moment of absence, somehow God reveals Himself to us. Do not lose hope if you are going through what the ancient saints would call the dark night of the soul. Believe that the God who is there with Jesus in the garden, even though Jesus cannot feel it, see it, or know it, He is there. But there's another dimension to this story besides the absence of God. It has been in the presence of God. And whereas our story started with everything going well up the mountain and things being decidedly edgy down at base camp, the roles are now reversed. The people are having an unforgettable, if ultimately regrettable, party. But there is a significant change in God's attitude. And if we can't hear that in the words that were read to us, Moses certainly does pick it up. Because God says to Moses, when he sees what's happening down at base camp, he says to Moses, "Go down at once. Your people, whom you brought out of Egypt, have acted perversely." Interesting, isn't it? They're Moses' people now. It's as if God is ready to wash his hands of the whole affair. It's your problem. It's your people. You sort it out. God is angry. I have seen this people, how stiff-necked they are. Now let me alone, so that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them. And of you I will make a great nation. I'm not sure that we sit very easily with this God. Just as we want a God that we can control, we also want a God that we fully understand. The trouble is that God is not manageable, predictable, or even at times comprehensible. And while we like to put God in a box, we find in reality that he is utterly complex. As Stan Mast notes, he says we must learn to sit with the complexity of God. Redeemer, quite like that one, and Judge, Lord and Avenger, loving and angry, all-knowing but open to human approach, unchangeable but responsive to human entreaty. It's not easy to sit with this God. Truth be told, we can find the presence of God as mystifying and unsettling as the absence of God. And I'm sure that Moses is no exception. You see, God has commanded him to go down the mountain to sort out that rebellious rabble. And as a sweetener, he offers him the deal of a lifetime. Moses will be the father of a great nation. It seems so obvious what Moses should do. But Moses is mystified and unsettled by God's command. You see, Moses has been 40 days in God's presence, and just when you think that things might be getting better or easier, they're actually getting harder and more difficult. I mean, whose side should Moses take? And here we encounter one of the most significant actions in all of Scripture. Moses takes the side of the people. Moses challenges God. You have to be a very brave person to challenge God. He argues with God. He refuses to leave God to his angry will. Moses enacts a daring intervention. He reminds God that those stiff-necked people down there are his people. And with great power, it was God who delivered them out of Egyptian slavery. And anyway, he puts on at the end, why give the Egyptians the satisfaction of a "I told you so" moment? And then Moses, having sort of put together his well-reasoned arguments, goes the next step. Some of us might have the courage to do what Moses has done so far. I'm not so sure about the next part, because all of a sudden, Moses makes demands of God. Turn from your fierce wrath, change your mind, and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, and your promise to them given in your own name. Stunning, isn't it? Here is the God who has the power and the capacity to free people from slavery under the most oppressive and powerful nation in the world. And Moses is telling this God what to do and what to remember. In Moses, we're confronted with the presence of God, which, as we've noted, can be perplexing, unsettling, and beyond our control. Moses isn't quite sure what to do. You know, the promise was given to Abraham and Isaac, and God's offering it to him. Now, we don't want to trifle with the holiness of God, but also we don't want to sort of meekly shy away from God either. Being in the presence of God can, on occasions, leave us with a deep assurance. And maybe many of us here today have had that experience at some point in our lives where the presence of God has felt very palpable and real, and it has been a great encouragement to us. But responding to His will and committing ourselves to His way is not always obvious and easy, as Moses found out. And if this is where we find ourselves at a place where maybe we are in the presence of God and we hear Him saying things to us and we're trying to work out just exactly what we should be doing, may I offer two things to ponder and pray about. First of all, learn from Moses. You see, Moses' daring intervention might seem beyond most of us, but his willingness to wrestle with God, to speak with God, actually produces a future. You see, Aaron's way just leads to death, but Moses' way leads to a future, a way ahead, a reconciliation between God and His people, a way to life. Moses takes a great risk, and we're astounded by his courage. But we're equally astounded by God's response to Moses. Because when you hear the story, God listens, God responds, and this is the most stunning thing. God changes His mind and His course of action. In other words, God is open to us. And the second thing, which we see most evidently again in Jesus, is to pray. Again, Henry Nouwen puts it beautifully. Prayer requires that we stand in God's presence with open hands, naked and vulnerable, proclaiming to ourselves and to others that without God we can do nothing. As disciples, we find not some, but all our strength, hope, courage, and confidence in God. Therefore, prayer is our first concern. And maybe that's a good place to finish this sermon, with the encouragement to pray. Whether we are wrestling with God's absence or wrestling in God's presence, pray, trusting as Jesus did that all our strength, hope, courage, and confidence is in this mysterious God, in this God that we can't always put into a box or put our finger on, this God who sometimes asks us things that seem almost impossible to do, but to trust as Jesus did that all our strength, hope, courage, and confidence is in this God, who, wherever we find ourselves, has promised never to forsake us. I don't know where you are all at. It may be that some of us are really wrestling with the absence of God. It may be that some of us are wrestling in the presence of God. But pray and trust that the God who says He never leaves us or forsakes us will find us wherever we are. Pray and open ourselves up to Him who is life eternal. Amen.